Welcome, everyone, to what I believe is penultimate session besides the social. After all the sessions are over, we get to talk with each other and learn more from each other. I am going to make introductions. First, a couple of logistical things. This event is being live captioned. So you'll be able to see the live captions if you click on the CC button at the bottom of your screen. If you have a mobile device, I believe it's on the bottom as well. So we're going to try to remember to talk a little bit slower, which is a problem for me. So yell at me if the captioner is not getting it right, and I'll slow down. Okay, so this is a webinar format, so all members of the audience are not going to have your cameras or microphones on. So if you have questions, please write them out in the Q&A. At the bottom of your screen, you see two little speech bubbles. Click on that, enter your questions in the Q&A, and then at the end, we will chat about it and text about it if you want to. But please use the Q&A so that it can be moderated to protect our speaker. Okay, so as chair, I need to make sure that the timing stays on task. I don't know what time is, it's not real. So I have a big clock right in front of me to keep on task. So without further ado, I need to tell you who I am. My name is Grace Sobrero, and I'm a third-year PhD student in philosophy at University of Minnesota. And I'm a disabled philosopher. I have a brain tumor, which was as big as an apple, and in surgery they got most of it, but I have a really cool fake skull on half of my head. But it presents a lot of fluid disabilities, cognitive, motor, speech. That's probably the most frustrating. And my hands just give away now and then. So I work on philosophy of disability and social epistemology, and broadly moral and political philosophy, with an eye to disabled people and disability justice with feminist philosophy bent. I view feminist philosophy as philosophy for everyone. So it naturally bothers me that I discovered that feminist philosophy was sort of this other thing, it's a little sub side world of philosophy. So I'm excited that we're here, and our guest speaker is here, and I am a huge fan. So I'm excited to introduce Catherine Clune-Taylor. She is a Black queer feminist scientist and technology studies scholar. She was born and raised in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, and is currently assistant professor in the Department of Women's Studies at San Diego State University. Catherine initially planned to go to medical school, receiving a Bachelor of Medical Science in Immunology and Microbiology from the University of Western Ontario. However, a chance encounter with work by feminist science scholars and bioethicists on the management of intersex conditions in children eventually led her to follow a different trajectory. After earning her PhD in philosophy at the University of Alberta, with a dissertation studying the science, ethics, and politics underwriting the treatment of intersex children under the, quote, disorders of sex development, unquote, treatment model, Catherine held a postdoctoral research associate position in the program in gender and sexuality studies at Princeton University from 2016 to 2019. She teaches intersectional feminist courses on sex, gender, sexuality, medicine, science, and technology studies to undergraduates. Clune-Taylor has published articles on intersex management in, forgive me if I mispronounce this, X, Journal of Existential and Phenomenology Theory, Phenomenological Theory and Culture in Hypatia. She's currently working on 2 book projects. The first expands on her doctoral project, examining the biopolitical management of sex and gender within the 21st century, focusing specifically on medical, bureaucratic, legal, and political efforts, including intersex management, to secure what she calls a, quote, cisgendered future, unquote, referring to an abstract trajectory of development across the lifespan in which multiple sex and gender variables remain in coherent alignment. Second project, The Matter of Black Life and Death, begins from an understanding of Black Lives Matter as an anti-eugenic movement and undertakes the political urgent task of situating contemporary racialized disparities in health outcomes and in access to healthcare, as well as other essentials for living, such as fresh water, in the wake of slavery. In particular, Clune-Taylor is interested in exploring the ways in which the American system of market-based health insurance tied to employment, as well as other racist and eugenic structures, maldistributed life chances to Black individuals in particular, shaping their lives and deaths in ways that are debilitating and disabling. In 2018-19, she served as president for the Canadian Society of Women in Philosophy. She's honored in 2020 to join the board of Interact, an organization supporting trans youth. Is that correct? Did I get the
Intersex
details?
youth.
Intersex youth, right. Okay, as of January 2020. So without further ado, I'm excited to hear this talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Grace, for that lovely introduction. And thank you everyone so much for being here. I am thrilled to be here to be joining you all across all of these different time zones. And I see a lot of folks I know attending, and that's so wonderful to see you all virtually. And I'll also say, I think this talk in particular feels real right now. You know, at the end of, I think for a lot of us, what has been the most difficult kind of teaching term of our careers, that comes at the end of a very long and strange year. And so I'm gonna start sharing my slides now and we'll get on with it. I'm also going to try very, very hard to speak slowly. That is not something that I'm generally naturally inclined to do, but I'm gonna try. So let's begin. So first, kind of a very brief introduction here. And that is that, you know, as I said, I'm honored to be here, and I just want to talk about kind of the bringing together of this project. So, you know, Shelley reached out to me at the kind of end of August, beginning of September of this year to put together, to get my title and abstract for this conference. And I put that abstract together at this time, which was, you know, coming at the end of, I'd been thinking a lot about how this felt like the end of what was my generation's new kind of long, hot summer, right? It was a period of time that had been marked in so many ways by the kind of emergence of this kind of racial consciousness. But at that time, I was also 5 months into isolating alone in my 1-bedroom apartment in San Diego, a place I had only moved 1 year earlier. So I wasn't quite into the period where I'd spent more time in isolation than not yet, although I am now. And like many Black folks, I was also, you know, trying to make sense of the physical and emotional strain of the kind of social and political world that had emerged following the murder of George Floyd. Further, I was at the beginning of a teaching term in which I was anxiously trying to deliver courses online for the first time as someone who felt very ill-equipped to do so. And also trying to figure out how to meet my students where they were. So many of my students were not only dealing with COVID-19, whether it was that they had it, whether it was that family members had it, but many of them were also, on top of that, working quite a bit. I had multiple students whose parents had lost their jobs due to COVID-19 or due to being furloughed during the pandemic. And so they were out working in order to help support their families, in large part because they were the lowest risk person in their families. And so, you know, it was clear to me that, like, I was dealing with the stress of the pandemic. I was also dealing with, you know, the stress of being a person who was, in particular, a Black woman in the United States. And further, I felt like, as a feminist science scholar with some background in microbiology, I felt like I had been kind of uniquely trained for this moment in time in both kind of helpful and wonderful ways, but also in deeply terrible ways. I think I felt like I had a good sense of what was going on, and in certain ways I could be very helpful to friends and family in terms of helping them navigate the sea of information out there and misinformation. But I also had a keen sense of kind of the long-term and larger effects of what was happening with regards to COVID-19. And there were times where I felt like I was Cassandra kind of yelling into the abyss. And so I give you all this backstory and tell you that this is the time that Shelley asked me for my blurb and my title for this. And I, like many of us, I think, was just grasping for different ideas or different concepts or different ways that would help me make sense of the world that we were in and the things that we were seeing, especially because I was looking all that, and then also looking at the kind of anti-mask protests that were emerging as well, that were clearly white supremacist in some form. And so I put together my talk for today, and I had been drawn to, during this time, I kept coming back to 2 points, or 2 quotes, or two kind of conceptualizations from Foucault. And one of those was Foucault's work in Society It Must Be Defended on the suicidality of the absolutely racist state. And so in Society Must Be Defended, when Foucault is discussing the Nazis in Nazi Germany, he says the following, and I have the quote here on the slide for folks. We have in the Nazi state, we have an absolutely racist state, an absolutely murderous state, and an absolutely suicidal state. A racist state, a murderous state, and a suicidal state. The 3 were necessarily superimposed, and the result was, of course, both the final solution, or the attempt to eliminate, by eliminating Jews, all other races of which Jews were both the symbol and the manifestation. And then Telegram 71, in which, in April 1945, Hitler gave the order to destroy the German people's own living conditions. And I had been thinking about this, or drawn to this quote, in order to kind of try to think through what I was seeing in terms of the anti-mask process, in terms of this kind of white supremacist desire or request to be put at certain kinds of risk. And then the second point that I kept coming back to, and the one that I decided to choose for my talk today to ruminate on a little bit more with y'all, is Foucault's discussion of crisis in The Birth of the Clinic. And so in The Birth of the Clinic, where Foucault is turning to consider the move from classical medicine or classificatory medicine to what we think of as modern medicine or clinical medicine between the 1700s and then into the 1800s. He discusses the role of the clinician or of the health practitioner of classificatory medicine in the 1700s as attempting to deduce or understand or get insight into the true nature of an illness, the true nature of a disease, which itself would necessarily kind of be mediated or muddied by the facts of the patient, right? The actual physical body of the patient, in a sense, mediated the disease. And so the clinician is attempting here to, in fact, abstract the patient, remove the body so that they can get a sense of what the illness is. And this is a quote from The Birth of the Clinic on page 15, where Foucault says, "If one wishes to know the illness from which he is suffering, one must abstract the individual with his particular qualities so that the clinician can know the disease or know the illness in itself and treat it accordingly." And according to my memory, the crisis was positioned as this uniquely important and potentially revelatory event in the process of the disease and of its deduction. That is, that the crisis was this period of time in the progress of the disease where, or rather it was an event, not so much about temporality, but it was an event where things could be seen clearly, things could be made clear. At least this is how I remembered it. And then the time came for me to put together this presentation. And it turns out, friends, I was maybe wrong. At the very least, I was wrong on the crisis bit. I was right on the rest of it. That is, when the time came for me to put this together, which of course was later than I had hoped, because the school term turned out to be wild and there was a lot of stress around the election and all of these other things. I got to reading, I returned to my copy of The Birth of the Clinic, and there was no discussion of crisis in that way, at least not in that text. And so it turns out I was wrong about what Foucault said about crisis, at least in this context. Although I also am not sure that I am really wrong. Like, it could be that I did read someone else who spoke about this in this way, because I do have a very vivid memory of this. But honestly, I'm not sure. And all of this, however embarrassing this whole situation might be, and I will say I also feel like it is peak 2020 vibes, I also feel like it is kind of beautifully illustrative of some of the phenomena that I wish to highlight here today in this wonderfully benign and very privileged way, right? Some of the very phenomena that I want to highlight here today is the effect that the kind of present that we are all living in has on us in terms of our bodies, in terms of our capacities, and in terms of our ability to function. And I'm going to say a little bit about function in a minute. That is one of the things that I want to get at here today, is the fact that we all often have certain understandings of what normal function means for us. And when I say normal here, I'm not talking about it in this normalizing sense of the term or in a kind of biostatistical sense of the term. You know, for example, as a neuroatypical person, what kind of normal cognitive function means for me is something that I recognize is going to be somewhat different from what it means for other people. Right. And so there is a sense of, and I have a sense of my own normal, right? That is what constitutes normal for me in terms of my life, in terms of my cognitive function. And I think most of us who have chronic illnesses or ongoing health issues are very aware of how sensitive maintaining the balance of our normal is. And so one of the things that I can say is that while you know, my own unique normal in terms of my own cognitive function is something that, yes, might not be the same kind of normal that everyone else would identify, but it's something I do have a sense of, right? And I do have a sense of the various kind of things that affect that normal and affect subsequently my capacities for doing various things in the world, like giving talks or doing research or teaching. And I can very clearly say that that normal has not necessarily been available to me within the pandemic in the same way, right? And I can say that though, as someone who nonetheless is very privileged as a Black woman in the US at this moment, right? Like throughout the pandemic, I have not had to have the same concerns about, am I going to be able to pay my bills? Do I have a check coming in every month? Am I going to lose my health insurance? And so even if there are a variety of larger kind of social and political issues, and there's a very high amount of stress that I am feeling, that is particular in a lot of ways to my position as a Black woman in the world, it is still pretty insignificant in some ways compared to many others who like me are Black women or Black men or are people of color, I should say. So one of the things or one of the mechanisms I want to introduce here is that of weathering or allostatic load. And weathering is as a process refers to the gradual wearing down of the body's systems by stressors that accumulate over time. And this is, or the process by which this occurs is referred to as allostasis. So allostasis is a type of physiological regulation in which the internal stability of the organism is maintained while the organism deals with a challenge or a crisis. So this is, we can think of this as a contrast to homeostasis when, for example, the body is, the body is maintaining an organism's kind of internal stability during the regular ebb and flow of life. And we know that being in allostasis, that kind of physiological regulation that occurs during a challenge or a crisis in high stress situations, you know, when people are kind of in cortico overload, right? High rates of cortisol are going on at all times, is that we get this gradual wearing down of the body's systems over time. And this in itself can produce chronic illnesses or chronic health problems such as cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and accelerated physiological versus chronological aging. And so to look at an example of this, this is, I think, unsurprisingly and quite unfortunately, Black women and their physiology have come to provide multiple examples of the effects of allostatic load and weathering on the body. And so, for example, there are pretty good studies that show that in general, Black women physiologically age faster. So based on studies looking at the length of the telomeres, which act as a kind of mitotic clock, telomeres are kind of at the end of your chromosomes, comparing those to individuals' actual chronological ages, we see that Black women at the ages of 49 to 55 are estimated to be about biologically 7.5 years older than white women within the same age group. And so this is all to say that our environment, that is our social, political, institutional, material, economic environment, constitutes not only disability, but impairment as well. It actually serves to constitute the physiological health or ill health of our bodies. And again, we don't need to index that to some sort of problematic totalizing norm, but I can still say that the environment has had an effect on what normal means for me or for each individual themselves, right? And so, you know, even if I'm wrong about the way that Foucault talks about crisis, whoops, the COVID-19 pandemic is nonetheless a crisis, right? And it has been revealing in a variety of ways. And what I would like to focus on here today for the rest of my time is that the kind of ways in which it's been revealing in terms of its eugenicist nature and function of the state, as well as the larger social body. That is, I think that what we've seen quite clearly, particularly through discussions of racial disparities in health and health access in the course of the COVID-19 pandemic, is the ways in which individuals are prematurely exposed to disability, death, and debilitation. That is, we're highlighting or are coming to see more clearly, I would say, the material conditions via which folks, and particularly BIPOC and disabled folks, are let die in Foucauldian terms, so are disproportionately kind of exposed to death. And so, indeed, the ways in which risk, vulnerability, morbidity, disability, debilitation, and mortality are socially constituted are really coming to the fore. And so for the last 3 slides here, I want to look at some of the specific ways that this might be happening. So structurally, physiologically, so at the level of the body, and even in the context of cure. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the vaccines and some issues around those. So first, just looking at some disparities, and I took this slide from Harvard University, where this is actually using age-adjusted data from the APM Research Lab, which is independently verifying data that's coming out of the CDC. And this is just seeing age-adjusted deaths, COVID-19 deaths, age-adjusted COVID-19 deaths. There we go. And one of the things that they point out here, we see that the kind of death rates here are far higher for Black in populaces versus Indigenous, Pacific Islander, Latinx, Asian, and then white populations. But this actually only goes through August 18th. Now, one thing that it's, one of the things that it's worth pointing out here is that, yes, this data is still from only August 18th, and we have seen such a significant rise in deaths within the last 6 weeks, that this data is a little bit outdated, but nonetheless, we see huge disparities here. And so from this data that was handled at this time, at that point in time, you could say that if other populations were to have the same death rate as white individuals as of August 18th, there should have been 19,500 more Black people alive, 8,400 more Latinx people, 600 Indigenous people, and 70 Pacific Islanders should have still been alive at that point if we had the same kind of death rate as white folks. Further, our hospitalization rates, we know that Indigenous folks are hospitalized about 5.3 times as much as white folks, and Black and Hispanic folks are hospitalized around 4.7 times as much as white folks. And I should say that, all of this data really also depends on where you are and how that's kind of indexed to your population. So for example, from a study from October of this year, we found that in Louisiana, Black folks made up 32% of the population, but 70% of deaths, right? Whereas white Americans made up 62% of the population in Louisiana, but recorded only 28% of COVID-19 deaths. So there is a variety of data with regards to racial disparities. What I'm more interested in here is thinking about some of the reasons why we see this. And so first, I'd like to talk about the constitution of risk and risk and vulnerability here. So one of the things that is quite clear is that there is a racialized and class privilege in terms of who gets to socially distance. And one of the things that I think is quite important to note is, and I think a lot of people who have been speaking in this conference so far have talked specifically about congregate care facilities, that this is quite an ableist privilege as well. Who gets to socially distance, who has the kind of job to socially distance or not, and how exposure or limiting your ability to be exposed is itself a kind of social privilege, right? There's also these issues of economic insecurity. So people of color were more likely to lose their jobs during the pandemic, many of whom then have to decide to go into high risk positions or positions that put themselves on the front lines in some way. One of the things that I think is very important to note is with the huge numbers of layoffs that we're seeing in the context of the US, that also means that individuals are losing access to health insurance as well. And so medical insecurity, that is individuals who are not able to, for example, afford their medications, who are rationing their insulin, are individuals who are attempting to make do and subsequently increasing their vulnerability of their risk of exposure or their risk of poor outcomes in relation to illness. Food insecurity is something we know that is also up. I have seen reports that food bank usage is up anywhere from 30% to 60%, depending on location. There was also a recent report that shoplifting is up, particularly of food and hygienic items. And so all of these things combine together to increase individuals' risk of exposure and risk of ill health. Further, there is this issue of racist oppression and political stress, right? I know that for many folks, particularly since the death or the murder of George Floyd, and in the context of the election, there has been a lot of political stress. But we have to note that for many people of color, many Black folks in particular, really what has happened is a lot of other folks have woken up to the kinds of things that we've been concerned about and anxious about and dealing with for many years. And so to see it get increased attention is great, but that doesn't necessarily mean that, that for example, somehow where it takes the edge off because more people are on board, right? And, and I think one of the other things is like we're seeing, despite the emergence of BLM or the kind of worldwide recognition that BLM got, nonetheless, racist things continue, right? Racism in the context of the pandemic in particular and the racialized effects of it continue unabated and in many ways unacknowledged. Further, there are the physiological effects of racism. And so this is from a very recent Washington Post article that says Black Americans, or the title of which was Black Americans are forced to operate in our entire lives in battle mode, and it is utterly exhausting. Almost all Black folks I know right now are absolutely bone tired and completely exhausted. We also know that one of the things that has come with the kind of racial consciousness raising that has occurred within the last year or last few months has been for many Black folks an increase in requests to do diversity labor, to do diversity work, to allay the fears of other white folks in their lives with regards to their own racism or lack thereof. And, I think any of the concerns or any of the information or any of the data that we've had with regards to the epigenetic effects of racism on Black folks has only compounded within the last little while. And so, I think all of us, no matter what our races are, have probably experienced the effects of high allostatic load in the last little while. But it's not clear that, and so we have a sense of what that is, what that kind of feels like. But the kind of compounding of it that Black folks experience is something that I really want to point to and highlight here, because I don't think that we do think about the physiological effects of that compounding over time. And finally, I'd like to say 2 points just with regards to the vaccine trials. And so that is one of the things that has emerged with regards to the vaccines, and one concern that has emerged is about Black folks in particular having hesitancy with regards to vaccines, and having a longstanding kind of distrust of the medical establishment due to, and understandably, due to the long history of scientific racism, of medical experimentation on Black folks, of non-consensual hysterectomies, for example, and of violations of Black bodies, of medical violence. And so this has been a recognized problem. For example, Anthony Fauci very recently spoke directly to the Black community, urging them to put aside their skepticism and saying he would be willing to get the vaccine, himself on camera, and also wants people to know that one of the individuals who played a huge role in the development of the vaccine, Dr. Kazmika Corbett, is a Black woman, right? So there is this real desire to reach out specifically to the Black community with regards to concerns about the vaccine and ensure that people do get themselves vaccinated. However, and while I want to say I'm very pro-vaccine, don't get me wrong, there are reasons for people of color to be concerned about the vaccines. So in particular, and I would say also people with disabilities and people of certain ages, right? So one of the problems is that we know that, for example, the AstraZeneca vaccine, one of its groups that its data is based on only included individuals under the age of 55, right? Which is problematic in terms of representation, especially if we think that some of those who are the most vulnerable are people over the age of 55, right? Excuse me, I should have gotten some water. Further, the other issues is that Moderna's or Pfizer's vaccine, both of those vaccines did not include enough Black subjects and enough Southeast Asian subjects. And so there are concerns here about the confidence interval, or the confidence interval with regards to the data specifically for those communities. So while it might be the case that we see that, it might be the case that in fact we can say that these vaccines are, yes, safe for these communities, there are questions about their efficacy for these communities, given the lack of representation of Black and Southeast Asian folks in these studies. So I'm going to leave it at that today. Thank you so much. I know we are already a little bit over time, and I'll stop sharing. And I appreciate everyone for listening and for coming. Thank you.
Okay, am I there? Thank you so much. This has been really upsetting throughout this whole pandemic. So thank you for breaking it down. Would you like to go get a glass of water? You can take a minute.
I'm okay. I'm
You're
okay.
Good? Okay.
Yeah, I had a moment, but I'm fine.
Okay. All right. We have Sarah Coppola asks, thank you for all of this, or first comments. Thank you for all of this. It has been incredibly relatable, and yes, indeed. Do you have any thoughts on the way general society has responded to having to live in ways many disabled people do full time. Limited mobility from home, unable to access social functions, dealing with some of the cognitive effects of allostatic load, etc. Is there a possibility to pivot towards empathy and a more accessible future going forward?
Yeah, Sarah, thank you so much for this question. I have been thinking about similar things. So one thing I would say is, yeah, I hope that this has been informative for people insofar as they realize and make these connections, right? Like, I think that, and I often have these moments when I hear people kind of complain about being in isolation or the effects of living in the way that we're living right now. And I will often say, you know, that's how a lot of folks with chronic illnesses live all the time, right? Like that's what happens. You have to deal with the unpredictability. You're not sure how many spoons you're going to have a particular day, right? Like I think the kind of variation in terms of what our individual understandings of normal is for us is something that a lot of people are experiencing now. And I think, unfortunately, I don't know that I think enough people are making the connection between recognizing that this gives them an insight into the lives of those with disabilities. And so I think we need to always continue to make this like, let's always keep reminding, always, you know, to me, I'm seeing it as an opportunity to make those links for folks, because I don't know that for a lot of folks, unless they have experienced a disability or have had someone with a disability in their lives, they have a real sense of what that means, or the fact that they are experiencing something similar to that right now. But I do hope that we have learned and taken away a lot of things from this in ways that do make the world more accessible moving forward. So for example, I know for myself and some of my colleagues, having to do things online now has given me insight into the way that certain things online are more accessible in ways I had not considered, even as someone who tries to think about disability, right? Like I hadn't thought about, for example, I had never considered teaching a class over Zoom or recording a class over Zoom. Like I had never considered that before in my life. But when I started doing it, I realized, it was so helpful for students who had different styles of cognitive functioning, who it was helpful for them to be able to replay a lecture and have me there with it. I've realized how helpful the chat function has been for some students, just being able to keep track of the discussion, or the auto transcription function on Zoom has allowed, you know, automatic closed captioning of my sessions. I think one of the things, I've said this in a couple of talks over the past year, is like, one of the things we need to recognize is that all of that stuff we've been saying for years about how disabled folks can't work from home,
Right.
turns out everyone can work from home. Like it turns out we can get that done real fast if we need to, and if we really want to, right? So I think what we're realizing is the kind of increased flexibility in how people work actually makes work a lot more accessible. And so I'm hoping we maintain that. I think, unfortunately, my concern is that we will maintain that, but primarily for capitalist reasons and not for actually helping people reasons. And so, you know, and I think I do really hope that this leads to a kind of greater discussion about capitalism, and the ways in which kind of ill health and the incapacity to thrive is constituted. I am somewhat, you know, worried about it, but I think that's a great question.
Great. Jonathan Wolf has a question. So Jonathan, go ahead.
So I'll just come onto the audio. I'll leave my camera off. So Catherine, it was really fantastic talk, and I was amazed to hear it, because with a co-author, I've been doing some very similar investigation looking at the disparities between different racial groups, both in the UK and in the US. And my colleague, who's much better at the statistics than me, has been looking at, you know, various patterns and saying, well, what about could poverty be the explanation of the racial disparities, or could it be patterns of work? Could it be patterns of living? And I think whatever we've looked at, even cumulatively, there's always there's a missing something, that nothing purely statistically seems to be able to explain the disparity. And so we left it, I think, as a sort of, there's a variable that just doesn't come out of the data. There's something else, right? And so so we thought, maybe there's a purely genetic explanation. Maybe you can't rule that out. More likely epigenetics. But you have the concept of weathering, which I was really fascinated with, because in a way, intuitively, we'd got that, but I don't think we'd seen this next step that you do with it, which is a sort of premature aging. Because I suppose if you then see, because one of the most striking factors, I think, in the numbers is the incredible gradients in age and certainly death, not necessarily infection. So I'm not sure the gradient in age and infection is so strong, but the rate of death, if infected, is really extraordinary when you look at the curve. So in this country, very, very few people, in the UK, very, very few people under the age of 60 have died. But when you get up to 80, so is this your hypothesis, that there's a sort of we need to distinguish biological age and chronological age, and that if we do that, then maybe we can plot everything on the same graphs again?
Yeah, so I think that's going to be part of it. I actually don't know. I don't know that I think it's going to be that simple as you're going to actually be able to find all the variables that completely fit. And in part, I think part of the issue is I think a lot of things are working in concert in ways that just escape the data, right? So I do think weathering is part of it. I do think this biological aging is part of it, but I also think we can look at biological aging by, comparing the ends of the telomeres, right? And getting that down. But that doesn't necessarily tell us about, weathering on particular organ systems. So how might this in particular be affecting like kidney function long-term? And also one of the things that really strikes me that I've kind of been trying to figure out a way to kind of think through or talk about, but is very much based on my own experience with my own father. So my father was a Black man who immigrated to Canada from the Bahamas, and he had very kind of conditions traditionally associated with Black men. So he was a diabetic with high blood pressure, he had kidney failure, all the associated stuff. And in many ways, he was someone who seemed like had a lot of chronic health issues, but they seemed fairly well managed until suddenly they weren't. And one of the things that I really kind of noticed with him was, he was kind of functional, but it was a house of cards, right? Like he was on a drug cocktail. He was dealing with a lot of stress. He had his own business. And so he clearly had issues around weathering for sure. But in a sense, he was managing a lot of chronic health conditions. And so there was a case though that when eventually it was just like the needle that broke the camel's back, right? Like all of the other things kind of start to come apart very quickly. And I think many individuals in this country are living in this kind of house of cards type way, right? Where, 1 month without their medications, and it changes that 1 month you can't afford your medications and you start rationing, and that changes your vulnerability, that changes your physicality in a way that now you get sick and like things turn very quickly. So I think that is definitely part of it. I think we need to think about these things about weathering. I don't think we're taking into account the effects of weathering, but I also think it's still an area that we need to learn more about. Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Okay, let's see.
There are more questions, but I also know that we're over
Yeah.
time, so I just wanted to
We
check in
are.
on that.
Jamie, Katie, what do you think?
I think we could probably, oh, go ahead, Joel, I'll defer to you.
One more?
Sorry, yeah, Grace. I think if there's one more question, we can take it because we did start slightly
Okay.
late. But
Okay,
I don't know.
great.
Great. Oh gosh. So JDWC says disabled is in the 20+ years older range by end of life. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
This is terrible for us.
That makes sense to me.
Oh, appearances aside, right? Okay. Jan, I apologize if I mispronounced your name. Jan Reinicki asks, thanks for the presentation. On the topic of being skeptical of vaccines or institutional healthcare, your presentation reminded me of the situation of HIV patients in the 80s America, where many patients, especially gay men, were skeptical of the mainstream medical narratives, which marginalized them and often saw them as guinea pigs. Do you see a way to make healthcare more quote unquote democratic in that sense? The HIV crisis and patients educate themselves to become experts and challenge actual doctors. Is this a possibility for activism today?
Yeah, thanks so much for this question. I think it's a great one, and it's, you know, I'm trying to think a lot more about the vaccines, and I will admit, like, because the vaccination information is newer and emerged while I was in the midst of teaching, I haven't gotten to read as much of it yet as I would like. I need to wait for that teaching stuff to end and to take a very long nap and then come back at the other side. But I appreciate this comparison because I do think there is a lot we can learn from HIV activists and HIV patients, especially those of us in the BIPOC community. And I will say one of the things, like, you know, I'm very excited about a vaccine. I think all of us are, but I also have worries, and I have worries, for example, I'm always concerned when we're hearing results from a pharmaceutical company press release. Like, I don't like that. I don't like it to start. But I do think there is a way that we could see folks this kind of becoming more democratic. I do see, I think, a lot of folks who are starting to educate themselves. One of the issues is, though, that we still don't know a ton, right? Like, we're still learning about COVID-19. We're still kind of understanding this. One of the things I'm also thinking a lot about, and I didn't talk about in this presentation, is often the only numbers that are being discussed are the mortality rates, and then we're just like, everyone else recovered, but we're not talking about who's been disabled, right? Like, many people are being disabled long-term by this condition, and so that is a population that I think we need to think and talk more about. But I do think, I do hope there will be more activism right now. For me right now, what I would like to see is people pushing for more people of color in trials, and to see those trials be ones that also acknowledge the history that people of color are overcoming in order to engage in that work, right? And that service for the rest of our community. I think in some ways the kind of exclusion is just the result of people being like, well, you know, we know they're going to be suspicious and we just don't want to deal with it. And it might mean that doing research is more difficult and requires more of researchers in terms of building community with the subjects. I think that's what it's got to be. Yeah. So thank you so much for that question.
Great. Thank you.
First of all, thank you so much, Catherine and Grace, for sharing a wonderful session. And yet again, I learned more and more and more. I think we're all doing that over the 3 days. So thank you so much.